This chapter looks at the idea of managing resources, and we look at this from two perspectives. In regard to strategic management, we examine the management of resources to create a viable strategy for the firm that's unique from competitors. We also look at the management of human resources. In particular, we look at potential tools for employee selection, since selecting good people is such a key part of this process. Atlas and David realized they need a specific strategy to be competitive in the restaurant industry. We use the old joke in this chapter that asks, what is the best way to make $1 million in the restaurant industry? And the answer is, start with $2 million. So this chapter begins with a discussion of the 4 generic business-level strategies developed by Michael Porter. This framework builds off of 2 key questions managers must answer when crafting their strategies. The first relates to their scope of operations. Does the firm want to operate in a broad market that appeals to many customers, or a more narrow domain with a particular niche or target market? The second question relates to source of competitive advantage. Does the firm want to compete based on cost by having low prices, or by exhibiting elements of uniqueness from competitors that allow them to charge higher prices? When used in tandem, the answers to these 2 questions result in 4 distinct strategies. Firms focusing on low cost while serving a broad market are following a cost leadership strategy. Places like McDonald's and Wendy's that have dollar menu offerings and offer a menu that a large number of individuals will like for a fairly low price fit this profile. Firms focusing on uniqueness while serving a broad market are following a differentiation strategy. Higher-end restaurants such as Ruth's Chris Steakhouse would fit this strategy. Firms focusing on low costs while serving a narrow market are following a focused cost leadership strategy. Subway, with its focus on healthier food options with less fat, would fit into this category because they focus on a more health-conscious demographic. Firms focusing on uniqueness while serving a narrow market are following a focused differentiation strategy. We mentioned in the book that restaurants focusing on a vegetarian or vegan audience would fall into this category. Where I live, the Earth Cafe in Norman, where OU is located, and the Red Cup in Oklahoma City are 2 unique restaurants here in Oklahoma that would fit this profile. The point of the study of generic strategies is that it provides a basic recipe to help managers think about the markets they are serving and the implications of the strategies they select to do so. So, generic strategies often serve as a starting point as a firm manages its product or service offerings over time. And the idea of simply starting in a direction and moving forward is important in management. There's a story the famed management scholar Carl Weick tells about a lieutenant who sends out a patrol into the Alps during a snowstorm. After a couple of days, he hadn't heard back from them and began to fear that he had dispatched his own men to their death. But just as all hope was about to be lost, the men returned. This was quite a shock. The lieutenant questioned his patrol and asked them how they made it back. One of his unit admitted that at first they panicked and considered giving up, and they began to wait to meet their fate. But then, one of the soldiers found a map in his pocket that helped calm everyone down. So, they made their camp and waited out the snowstorm. When the snow subsided, they used the map to get their bearings and they made their way back. As simple as that. But here's the strange part of the story. The lieutenant asked to see the map, and it turns out the map in the soldier's pocket wasn't even a map of the Alps where they were. As it turns out, the map was actually of the Pyrenees Mountains miles away. The point of this story is that sometimes any old map will do. So, the important thing is to keep moving and taking action to survive in an uncertain world. Another key concept in this chapter is the resource-based view of the firm. Resource-based view of the firm examines qualities of resources that make them useful for organizations. If your collection of resources is unique, such as Duff Goldman's on the TV show Ace of Cakes, your company can outperform competitors and you can charge thousands of dollars for a cake instead of the $20 they charge at the grocery store. In this view, resources should have 4 qualities. They should be valuable, rare, difficult to imitate, and non-substitutable. Valuable resources increase efficiency and effectiveness and help the companies to seize opportunities and overcome weaknesses. For example, Southwest Airlines' organizational culture is a valuable resource because their employees are intensely loyal to the organization in an industry where strikes and layoffs are common for other airlines. The idea of rare resources often refers to the unique ways that resources are bundled together. For example, Southwest Airlines historically only used 737 airplanes, and thus all of their pilots were trained on only one type of plane. So if a pilot was ill, any of their other pilots could fill in, a trick other airlines couldn't pull off since pilots have to uniquely be certified to fly a particular plane. and they can't copy this strategy now, as selling off all their other planes in an effort to copy the strategy of Southwest would be expensive and create other difficulties. Difficult to imitate resources exist when competitors are unable to replicate the resource. An example would be the legal protection offered to books by a copyright, where only the publisher can print and sell the book. Numerous intellectual property rights exist, such as copyrights, patents, and trademarks, that make products or services difficult to imitate by establishing legal ownership of the work, design, process, or mark. Of course, just keeping your ideas a secret can also be an effective way to manage intellectual property. That's why the formula for Coca-Cola and the 11 herbs and spices used in Kentucky Fried Chicken are closely guarded secrets. Non-substitutable resources exist if no other similar or different bundles of resources by competitors can provide the same value to customers. For example, the brand loyalty that was built up when supplying to GIs in World War II made a Coca-Cola non-substitutable for some individuals. Even today, based on fierce loyalty, many folks will just opt for water if Coca-Cola isn't available in a restaurant. So while there are clearly competitors for the soft drinks such as Pepsi, or substitutes such as coffee or orange juice, non-substitutable within the resource-based view means that the strategies of competitors cannot effectively substitute for the strategy and collective resources offered by Coca-Cola. Ideally, a firm would possess all four of these types of resources. If they only possess some of them, their advantage may only be temporary. When all four are met, then a firm is much more likely to have long-term competitive advantage and enjoy superior performance in contrast to their competitors. Explaining how resources work within the context of the resource-based view of the firm can be illustrated with Aesop's fable of the ass and the grasshoppers. As the story goes, an ass was enchanted by the chirping of some melodic grasshoppers and wished to acquire that ability. When the ass asked the grasshoppers what enabled them to sing so sweetly, they revealed that the only thing that nourished them was the sweet morning dew. In an effort to copy the grasshoppers, the ass began to follow their diet. So, the ass decided to only eat morning dew from that moment on. Perhaps not surprisingly, the ass soon died of hunger. This fable illustrates the notion of resource immobility. Classic economics suggests that any resource that leads to short-term advantage can be imitated when other firms purchase that resource on the open market. If this logic was true, the ass should have been able to duplicate the grasshopper's songs by using the same inputs as the grasshoppers. But the resource-based view of the firm suggests that a firm's unique set or bundle of resources is the key to competitive advantage. Consequently, the purchase of a single resource, such as the morning dew, may not lead to competitive advantage and superior performance because it might not be as useful in some organizations as others. If Aesop were around today, he might tell the moral of the story in this way: if you copy the strategies of other firms blindly, you may end up losing your ass. We see this idea of unique resources that can't be easily integrated into other organizations in a lot of contexts. For example, many college quarterbacks with excellent stats on passing yards might be labeled as system quarterbacks that might not do well in the pros. In the NFL, teams might build around a franchise quarterback that league rules make difficult to trade. So, a quarterback that does great in one team may not integrate easily into others or may be contractually prohibited from moving around too much. This value placed on resources highlights the importance of effectively selecting human resources, and there are a number of techniques to help managers better select the right person for the job. Initial selection includes things like application forms and background checks. The point of this step is to qualify the applicant for the job at the most basic level. Substantive selection includes things like written tests, performance simulations, and work sample tests. Interviews are also a common substantive selection method. The point of this step is to determine whether the applicant can perform the job satisfactorily. Contingent selection includes things like drug tests and submitting your official transcript. The point of this step is to satisfy final requirements for the job. If the applicant passes contingent selection, the job is theirs. While it's important to understand the kinds of things managers do to effectively select employees, we also want to point out mistakes in hiring, such as asking interview questions that are illegal. In this chapter, we make the joke that asking people their age, if they're single, and if they've ever been arrested might make sense if you're looking for a date, but you are legally prohibited from asking these questions of individuals that you are considering hiring. And there are a number of questions that fall into this category in the United States that are illegal for a number of reasons. For example, You can't ask individuals how old they are because you can't discriminate based on age for those who are older than 40 years old. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act protects workers from this kind of discrimination. And you should avoid questions that might seem to discriminate based on marital status. For example, you can't ask someone if they are planning on getting pregnant in the future. These kinds of questions are generally seen as a form of sexual discrimination. You can't discriminate on charges that weren't proven. So while you can ask if someone has been convicted of a felony, you can't ask someone if they've been arrested. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits religious discrimination and requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for the religious practices of prospective employees. You can ask employees if they are available to work on weekends, but not their religion or where they go to church. While you can ask if someone has a legal right to work in this country, you can't discriminate based on citizenship by asking if they were born in a certain country. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 prohibits discrimination for individuals with disabilities and also requires reasonable accommodations for those with disabilities. So you can ask questions that relate to duties required to do the job, but you can't ask individuals if they have particular disabilities. This chapter provides an overview of resources that are important for organizations, as well as some insights into methods to effectively select the human resources needed to run organizations. It's been said that the people make the place, so both human and organizational resources are critical for organizations striving to outperform the competition. So knowledge of methods used to effectively select these kinds of resources is critical for managers, and I hope this chapter has provided some insights that are helpful for you in this regard.